Y muchas gracias por su amable invitación a presentar algunos de mis trabajos en este interesante taller académico. Me gustaría dar las gracias especialmente a Mercedes García Ferrari, Cristian Palacios Laval y Andrés Pereira. Me hubiera gustado participar plenamente los 2 días, pero desgraciadamente estamos en un periodo muy ajetreado y no recibí esta invitación hasta hace unas semanas, después de haber conocido a uno de los participantes en una conferencia sobre fronteras inteligentes en Dresden, en Alemania. Espero que en el futuro haya más oportunidades de conocer a muchos de ustedes y mantener una conversación más profunda y adecuada sobre el fascinante trabajo que ustedes realizan. Ahora hablaré en inglés, ya que a lo mejor haré muchos fallos en español sin saberlo. Okay, so I'll switch to English. What I'm going to show you is work that I've conducted together with Paula Hara, a researcher at Tampere University. We became interested in passports and the history of passports. I personally, because I've been interested in the question of the human physical face and its mediation into a particular form of images. And I've been specifically interested in the question why, for many of us, it has become considered to be normal that photos of our faces and videos of our faces are taken. And there's been a huge shift in the last decades in regard to that. And if I speak too quickly, or if you don't understand some of the aspects I'm saying, feel free to just say quickly, so I can go slower, or then we can go through some of the aspects. So what we did with Paula Hara is we collected passports from different archives, from museums and from individuals, but as well from a company which develops passports from the early 19th century until today. So our earliest examples are from very early 19th century. And we focus on Finland, and you'll see on the right-hand side an image of Finland. Finland is in the northeastern part of Europe. It borders to Russia. It has the longest land border to Russia. And in the map, you see different areas where border-related questions are processed in Finland. So you have actual border crossings, which you see in the map, but then also specific sites where you have, for example, administration, which deals with border questions. And some of you might know that not long ago, Finland has closed all the borders to Russia. So the question regarding passports and mobility is also very pertinent today at this exact moment. We collected around 200 examples, with the idea always when we collected an example was that there should have been a kind of a difference in the material document in regard to other documents which we have collected. So we were very inspired by Craig Robertson's work on the history of the US passport, and especially the kind of an idea to focus on different media techniques, different cultural techniques, for the photograph, the signature, ways of using stamps, for example, how institutional actors get to be seen in the passports and not. And then we've conducted oral history interviews with developers of passports, with border officials, and with the police, currently 8. And we've been in conversation with a range of other people without having formal interviews. And some of the people with whom we've been in contact with are people who develop passports, which are not only interesting and important for Finland, but there are only a few large companies in the world which actually do passports because of the technical complexity involved. And one of the head designers happens to be in Finland, very close by to where I live in Helsinki. The approach which we use is called a practice theoretical approach, which is interested in mediations. And we follow the work by people such as Susan Lee Starr, Geoffrey Bowker, Ea Chitpelz, but also Andreas Rekowitz, who talk about the primacy of specific kinds of practices in order to understand particular documents, for example, or information systems, or the use of particular visual technologies. And Susan Lee Starr is very important in the sense that she's been talking about the ways in which very different kinds of actors use specific media in order to interact with each other. And they do not have to agree with each other, but the media which they use allows them to cooperate. And she talks about the cooperation without consensus. And a passport is a good example of kind of a device, of a medium allowing for cooperation without different parties necessarily having consensus with each other. And we're interested in some anthropological approaches which focus on the importance of skill, becoming a skilled practitioner in perceiving in particular kinds of ways or in doing work in very specific kinds of ways. And some of that work, for example, by Christina Grasseni and Thomas Kieser, is also interested in looking at specific kinds of practices when people interact with each other, to look at the specific kind of media which becomes very important for those kinds of actions, which directs the attention in a specific kind of a situation. And they call this focusing media. And you can in a way claim, and we claim, that passports are such focusing media in particular kinds of border crossing settings, for example, where the passport gets a specific prevalence. And you'll have a few other people who are interesting for us in that way, like Charles Goodwin on professional vision, Tim Ingold on perception and the environment, James Jerome Gibson on affordances, or Hans Belting on the anthropology of the image. And we're interested in the role of the image in mediating social situations. So there are discussions on operativity, non-representation, and the importance of technical images. And to highlight the importance of focusing media, you'll see this quote, which tries in a way to say or to pinpoint the importance of specific technologies, specific media in particular kinds of actions, and how a focus on those kinds of media might help us understand specific actions, and at times also, like historically, when we personally are not anymore there to witness the actions themselves. And our main research question, which we are currently pursuing, and which we also looked at when we were in Dresden, is to see if there's an interrelation between particular kinds of changes in passport documents and passport registers, if we can see that specific archival changes in information infrastructures also become visible in these documentation materials themselves. And I'm sorry, I have to just get the message out now. And we conducted a lot of the collection work in 2019, just before the COVID started. And had the chance to showcase a lot of the documentation, which we found ourselves very interesting at the Finnish Museum of Photography, and then published a book in Finnish about it. And then the pandemic happened, which in a way brought again from another kind of a vantage point, the importance of regulation of mobility and movement, which is very clear to many of you who are interested in questions of migration, for example, or difficulties related to those, but which became very important for many basically regular people who do not think about these questions a lot. And this is the text which I understood you have at least seen. So some of the argumentation you will find there. And what I'll try to do is provide some space to go through basically 4 kinds of passport regimes, as we try to call them in the paper sent out, and then we can have a discussion about that. And I'm very much looking forward to your comments and ideas and suggestions. And we also had a small conversation with Mercedes earlier. And one of the aspects which we brought up in the discussion already is that there are, of course, very important differences also between different kinds of places. So different countries in Latin America, for example, or different countries in Europe or different Asian countries. So that's also something which we might ponder about. So in an AP news clip from 2017, introducing novel smart technologies, a blonde woman in sleek and casual but elegant attire walks toward the service counter at the Helsinki airport gate and is immediately greeted by name by ground personnel and handed a boarding pass for a passenger plane. And the head of ground experience at the time, so this is 2017, explains, well, customers, they just arrive to the airport, proceed for the check-in, and then there's what she calls the invisible red carpet moment. So the check-in agent knows immediately what's the name of the customer and where she's traveling to. And airports of several times have been testing technology for such purposes, this being one of the first ones at the time, to identify frequent flyers so that they get what is here called the red carpet moment, being identified as someone special belonging to the high-speed and high-mobility kinetic elite without needing to present any travel documentation at all. In the prototype case presented, the frequent flyers each upload 3 selfies to a purpose-built application so that they can be recognized later by means of facial recognition. Instead of an individual needing to present identification documents or speaking on one's own behalf, the physical face as a surface of the body itself acts as the site studied for determining a passenger's identity and eligibility for travel. In order to be studied, it has to be transformed into a technical image that can be manipulated and operated upon. So here you see a documentation of one of the early pre-studies for the prototype, which I showed you. It is this interrelation between embodied physical faces and their translation into digital form that I call the digital face. By evoking the complex history of the face, the term digital face moves attention from purely technical deliberation of machine vision and its impact on today's visual regimes to the interrelations among images, bodies, and visual technologies, thus suggesting that digital faces rely as much on the effective and moral social choreographies needed for allowing our faces to be depicted at all. So my particular interest, as I explained earlier, lies in exploring why it has become considered normal for our faces to be depicted for and transformed into computing environments, such that today images of digital faces proliferate. This vignette, presenting a vision of what is called hands-in-pocket travel, is, according to one of the developers of the prototype that I showed, part of a broader design paradigm called Zero UI, or Zero User Interface. It wants to get rid of screens as user interfaces and instead to design artifacts, environments, and systems that react directly to our bodies, gestures, and glances. And it's a vision that is in line with early suggestions for ubiquitous computing, for those of you who are interested in the history of computing. This means that camera technology and computer vision is only a part of a broader setup that is able to detect, trace, individuate, and sort bodies. The developer envisions a future in which your body is used to authenticate you without any other documents needed, maintaining that machine detection and recognition already is, and in the future will be, more accurate than that of human operators. According to this vision, body surveillance is considered a privilege that should be embraced in order to allow for smoother travel. As this example shown from another company called Sita, these prototypes are heavily invested in, and today we can find globally a wide range of prototypes and infrastructures available with future visions advancing zero UI solutions, in which, as is advertised in this screenshot from a web page, your face is your boarding pass or your face becomes your passport. As Sarah Kember has argued, this kind of smartness is a consequence of the convergence of imaging, information, and biotechnologies, which relies as much on fantasies found in sci-fi films, as well as on fears related to an inability to control. Smart photography, smart travel documentation, and smart borders are, in this vision, sites of privilege and sites of entitlement, allowing a socially sorted kinetic elite to travel while making that same travel very difficult for others. While security companies and those providing what is called smooth people flow, for example, airline, train, or elevator companies, heavily advertise these kinds of smart solutions for various environments, I will in the following trace some of the histories of the smart passport in order to contrast these with visions of hands-in-pocket travel. I argue that these visions rely on specific infrastructural media that has been relatively slowly digitized and centralized into joint databases. So some of the future visions related to this kind of a scenario, which would be part of the fourth regime of the four ones to be presented, where the body acts as a surface to be deciphered and compared to existing databases, and where it's introduced as a social privilege. And smartness in these visions is understood to rely on an always-on information infrastructure, which is part of the visions which Mark Weiser had for ubiquitous computing. So it's something which goes to the background and is always on, sensing the environment, and may be updated when necessary, when, for example, travel documentation changes on the fly. And it's filled with dreams of full automation. And it relies on a specific will to be surveyed, where surveillance is not framed mainly in terms of control, as it's very often discussed, but rather in terms of care and empowerment. And some of the arguments go that institutions granting passports exhibit care for individuals and citizens, for example, which you historically see in written requests to assist the grantee in free travel and in the case of unexpected circumstances. And there's a kind of a sense, an individual sense of being empowered when moving faster, easier, longer, by allowing your whereabouts to be added into registers and providing access to institutional actors for cross-checking. And the will to be surveyed is embodied. Bodies are taught to become skilled practitioners of being surveyed. Our passport issuance has always combined questions of social morals and the accuracy of control. In the 19th century, in order to get a passport, applicants needed to get a signed document from the rural police chief in order to show that they are free to travel and do not owe, for example, taxes, need to serve in military, or have a prison sentence to serve. In this example from 1880, the police chief testifies in writing, so you'll see it in above, writing that sen todistan, that the named person called Leander Juhonpoika Annola from a very specific location, Kalajoen pitäjästä ja Etelän kylästä, is free to travel abroad. Besides the handwritten testimony, the police chief has signed the paper, provided a running number 171, and added a seal providing further assurance that the document in itself is authentic. While the police chief, that's the text above, provides locative information of where the person described is from, it is the minister of the local church, that's the text below, who provides additional detail of when the person has been born, saying February 27, 1851, but more importantly, that the person is considered to be respectable and blameless, in Finnish, kunniallinen ja moitteeton, and also stating that skills in Christianity are only tolerable and have not received, the person having not received the Holy Communion in several years, since 1875. The role of the minister of church is hence both one of an assessor of morals, as well as that of a bookkeeper who can consult and add novel information to the parish register, which has been collected in Finland and in Sweden since the 1530s. As can be deduced from the entry that the person has not attended Holy Communion in several years, the minister provides idiosyncratic knowledge, which further provides a feeling of validity to the accounts provided. So to give context, maybe you will not know it, that Finland gained independence as its own state in 1917. And from the beginning of the 19th century, it was an autonomous part of Russia. And before that, it was for centuries part of Sweden. So that's why many of the church registers or the registers of parishes were basically similar to the ones which you would have in Sweden too. And to show a further example, 35 years later, from 1915, you'll see that movement was very much regulated, not just across borders, but also within the country in itself and within very small areas. So this is a certificate written by a father to his two sons that they are allowed to go outside of a small county to work. And in this paper, you see also that the father has been illiterate and has not been able to read or write himself. And there's someone else who acts as a witness providing that information. And it's an example of the basically of the kinds of dangers which were connected and still today are connected to people physically moving from one place to the other. So the kind of smartness in passport issuance at the turn of the century was distributed among a range of institutionally important stakeholders who needed to meet physically the person applying for a passport. So you had to be in a physical face-to-face situation, provide in handwriting a certificate, marking the surface of paper with hand gestures, providing visible evidence of the physical meeting. And usually they also had to have lived experience of the applicant because they lived close enough and knew about those living among them. So for example, the minister could talk about the deficiencies in living out Christianity of that one person applying for a passport. The importance of these social bodies and the individual representatives was also visible in the passports at the time. The person traveling was usually only named, perhaps with a profession mentioned, but otherwise passports bore the insignia of those issuing them, such as seals with handwritten signatures, as well as spelled out names. More important than who the person carrying a passport was, were those who had issued the passport. So in this kind of a first regime, which we argue with Paula, lasted more or less until the First World War, passports were basically letters of reference and much less documents of actual identification. And here you see an example from early 20th century of passport register. So you'll have a registry of certificates of non-impediment, which had to be collected before actually getting a passport, provided by a local police chief in a small area called Nurmijärvi. And if you look at the amount, it's from 1909. There you'll see 4 months. You'll have January, February, March, and April. And there are not that many passports which were issued at all. So you had 29 at the time. And you'll see that the names and then an occupation are named, where the people came from, when they were born, and where they would be going to. And this where was at the time, it was either just very general, going somewhere outside of Finland, or as very many people migrated to America, it said specifically towards America. In the passports from the 19th century, from the end of the 19th century, you usually already find in the material which we collected, you find specific spaces for writing down embodied characteristics, so-called signalments of the people traveling, but they were usually not filled out. So in our material, we don't have those filled out. And one of the difficulties of filling that information out is, of course, because you would not know exactly how to do it. And in a lot of related literature, there's this kind of an idea that when Bertillon started the work in Paris on the portrait parlé, which I'm sure many of you will know pretty well, that that would have somehow directly been applied to passports, but that doesn't seem to be the case, not in Finland. And with other colleagues I've been talking about this with, I haven't found that that would have been converted directly towards passport issuance. And I think one of the reasons has to do with the question of the importance of social class and representation in getting the passport in itself. And here you'll see a guidebook for forensic identification, which also shows that it's very different from the Bertillon system that they here suggest. And the kinds of categories suggested are very simple, and ones which you could basically relatively easily mark out. So you have very crude characteristics of, for example, facial forms, which were supposed to be written in order to identify people. And this is for forensic identification, but it's from the police museum, where we've gotten materials for the passports as well. And there's been some discussion about this documentation or similar documentation being perhaps also used for the signalments, because they are very crude as well, as you will see shortly. So during the First World War, because of fear of spies and fear of terrorists and fear of not being able to deal with borders correctly, especially many European countries started to mandate the use of embodied characteristics in passports. So passport photographs became then important. And in our material, you start also to see some of this signalétic information, so the kind of embodied information written out. So here you would have length 166 centimeters. Oh, I'm sorry. 166 centimeters, then kind of an idea of the whole body gestalt, the whole body form being corpulent in that case, and the hair being light brown, and going through different categories, but they are the categorization is very crude, and it's actually very difficult to identify anyone based on this kind of information. But I said more or less at the same time as these signalments start to be filled out more, we also start to have the first photographs, which you find in that material. And there are examples, for example, in Robertson has these examples of Chinese work migrants coming to the US, and their photos being taken already at the end of the 19th century. But basically, you can say that in quite a few cases, photography becomes important with the First World War. And he'll have a shift in the way in whose bodies become important in the marking of the document. So you still have the right-hand side of the document with stamps and signatures, which come from the police officers and the police chief, who are very important in actually showing that they have personally witnessed that person and they testify that this actually is that person who that person claims to be. But you start to have traces of the body of the applicant also involved into the passport documentation itself. So on the one hand, with the idea of mechanical objectivity via photography, thinking that somehow a bit of the person is transferred via the photograph into the document. Then you'll have on top of the photograph a signature, a hand-side signature by the person. Then you have the seal, the stamp of the police in Helsinki, and then you have a seal on top of it, and particular forms which try to make it difficult to tamper with that information. So that became very important right at the start. But just in order to show you some of the examples of these early materials, where you show that see very clearly that the kind of a mugshot aesthetic or the aesthetic of Bertillon's portraits palais was not to be found in the material. It's actually not found until the 1950s in the material which we've collected. And in some countries, you find it already a little bit earlier during the Second World War, for example. But you see, in a way, the importance of entitlement, of, in a way, social class in being portrayed and being shown, and the way in which it becomes considered to be okay for your body to be actually part of this documentation and part of state registering practices. And in quite a few cases, you see that the images are very difficult actually to use for identifying anyone. So there's this kind of an understanding or a kind of an idea that just by being photographed, just by the photographic camera having been used, that would be enough in order to testify that that is actually the correct person, which is very much counter to the way in which we think today about these kinds of questions. And quite a few of the photos which you can find, you'll see that they come from very different situations. They haven't been made usually explicitly for these kinds of documents, but they come from other kinds of sources. And because you needed to have non-impediment certificates, usually you had to send 2 images in at the time. You'll see from these examples that they are basically part of studio portraiture in most of the cases, but we also find village photographers, for example, or other kinds of avenues where people just happen to have the chance of being photographed. Here on the text, it says Happy New Year. So it's also a kind of a good example of the photograph itself being initially taken for very different purposes than what it later on became important for. And you'll find collages, like in this one. This is from the 1940s, so quite late, the Second World War. So collage and collective passports, which have later you don't find them anymore, but in the beginning, collective passports were very usual. So it was somehow followed the kind of an idea that usually there is one person who can then again be responsible for all the other ones who travel with you. So travel was not necessarily as individualized as it today in many cases is, when even children need to have their own passports. And in the this is an example also from the Second World War, when naval legislation came in, which made it difficult for you to actually travel with the actual documentation which you had, so with the passport which you had. So here on the right-hand side, you'll have a stamp which says that although there's this novel legislative act which says that that you cannot, or it's not, you couldn't travel in the way in which you could earlier travel outside of the country. This stamp says, well, actually, having this stamp and having these people sign it, you actually can travel again. So the documentation material lets itself to be tampered, and you have standardized forms for doing so, that you have a stamp which can be used many, many times. So you get different forms of being in contact with the documentation material in itself. And this is one of my own favorites because it shows a bride from a wedding portrait, and it's cut out from the wedding portrait in order to be able to travel. So again, a kind of an example, and this is from 1950. So it shows in a way the low standardization of facial imaging, but also of the ways in which people actually could be easily identified. So you could argue that until the 1950s, in quite a few cases, of course, depending on the specific passports, but well, or let's say it like this, until the First World War, almost anyone who was of the same gender and was part of the same class, social class, could possibly travel with the documentation which you had, because you had learned the skilled behavior, the skilled embodied behavior in order to participate in that social class. Then until the 1950s, if you had some kind of a resemblance with the person in the documentation, it allowed you to travel with that kind of resemblance, because the identificatory categories were not as exact as they have later become. And at the end of the 1950s, especially in the 1960s, we start to have more structuration in the facial images. And that shows in the novel structures of archives as well, which start to happen more or less at the same time. So the ways in which the documentation, identification documentation is worked with starts to bear resemblances to the actual visual form. That's at least some of the resemblances that we are seeing here. And here you still see a very gendered way of having passports. There was always the idea that it would be the passport would be a passport for a man. And if it was not a passport for a man, but for a couple, as in this case, there's still they are separated, the male and the woman in the passport documentation side by side, and the information regarding the husband and then the spouse are on top of each other. So there's a kind of an idea of an ideal social unit as well, which is inscribed into this documentation at the time. And here you'll see, still in the 1950s, you'll see these signalments written out. And you also, it depends very much on the specific time. But at this time, for example, you have 6 languages which are printed into the passport. So you have Finnish, you have Swedish, French, English, German, and Russian, which was basically the idea. This is where most of the people would be traveling towards. These would be the contact points where someone would need to have a knowledge of those languages in order to be able to read the passport. But then if you look at how they are actually filled out, it depends on the actual passports themselves. But in this case, you'll see that it's in Finnish, it's in Swedish, and it's in English, in which they filled them out. Sometimes they are filled for example, in Russian and in Finnish, sometimes only in Finnish, sometimes maybe in Finnish and Swedish. So very much also depending on the imagined audience of border control who might be interested in the documentation. And in the 1960s, when, and I'll show you now examples of this, the importance of the archives, you'll see that a lot of that information, which you see here written in hand, is already prescribed. So you have a prescribed model of how that information is provided in the passport documentation, which gives you an idea that they will have had an archiving system and a kind of an archival system and a database structure for creating, for using some of these categories. But because they were still by hand marked, you'll see in regard to the eyes, for example, which you have here, and in this case of the passport, you have Finnish, Swedish, and French. You'll see that they've marked 2 areas, which complicates the whole, of course, informational structure and the database structure itself. So while there's an important history in passport development up until the 1960s, including the use of signalments, different forms of photography, as well as different ways of centralizing registers, in Finland, the early 1960s was very important for passport development, as citizens received first in 1962 a pension number, so a kind of a social welfare effect. Again, something which has to do with this idea of surveillance for care and surveillance for empowerment in order to come up with personal codes. Individuating adult citizens for purposes of social welfare with numbers instead of a name, a system which was expanded in 1971, with the personal code to each citizen. So first starting in a particular kind of an area, which we know from a lot of inscription techniques and surveillance technologies that they are introduced in a particular kind of an area, and then they become more general. The introduction of numbers for individuating citizens went hand in hand with infrastructural developments, as in 1969, the National Population Registry was founded, and in 1971, early forms of digitization started. The first electronic passport registry was created in 1987 and centralized into the banknote printing press of Finland's bank. And there are many commonalities between money and the history of money and the history of passports. And in 1999, its upkeep became part of the work of magistrates. The digitization of passports occurred partially, with applicants' photographs being digitized already in the 1980s in order to facilitate the engraving into the document page, so that it became much more difficult to exchange photos and passports. The photograph, still provided by the applicant as a print created with analog means, was digitally scanned by the police, and interlocutors in interviews tell that specific idiosyncratic aesthetic preferences of individuals working on these scans could be deduced by those working with them. So on the right-hand side, you'll have an actual digital image, which has been inscribed into a polycarbonate page. And the individual aesthetic preferences would be by those scanning them. So some of them would prefer different kinds of tones, for example, or visibility around particular areas of the eyes. And the people we have talked with said that at times they could, in a way, tell who has scanned which kind of a photo because of the aesthetic preferences they had. At the same time, machine readability was implemented into the passport. So you'll see that below at the bottom of the page, so that specific information could be both inscribed as well as read and compared by relying on the electronic passport registers. The full name, date of birth, a binary form of gender, a personal code, passport number, as well as nationality became machine readable. In stark contrast to earlier passports from the late 1980s onwards, neither passport issuers nor applicants were anymore allowed to modify any aspects of the passports by hand. So on the left-hand side, you have the same person and an earlier passport, which was still valid until 1990. And the next, and you'll see a lot of handwriting. You'll see a photograph which has been put there by hand. And you see the signalments, which have been filled out now with crosses, on the right-hand side, no one is allowed to write anything on the actual identity page anymore. So the kind of an idea which we had in the beginning in the 19th century, that someone representing an institution as an individual body would need to physically mark a kind of a document in order for it to be trusted. And later on, those kinds of markings had to be taken from the person as well, who should be identified with the documentation, is not to be found in the same way anymore in the passports on the right-hand side. So even the signature is not written directly on the passport anymore in that example, but it's scanned and then engraved into a polycarbonate page. And the page in itself has an interesting history going back to safety glass for automobiles, as researchers started to notice that getting glass and polycarbonate together made glass stronger, and it didn't burst as easily into pieces as regular glass, but also, and importantly, again, for the history of the document, but also that any tampering would be quickly visible because of splinters. So if in the first photograph you saw the seal and the stamp and the signature by hand, etc., in this case, and which made tampering difficult, in this case, in the right-hand side, if you would try to break part of the page, it would be very difficult. It would splinter into many parts. It would be difficult to deal with it. So the digital image is inscribed inside the passport page already here, and novel polycarbonate layers are used to seal the information inside. As an idea, it already provides a forebearer to the electronic chip that is later introduced and that many of you will know, which also resides inside the passport document itself. And although non-tampering is a kind of an ideal, again, when the database structures do not fit, as in this example, there's handwriting because the person has so many names, they don't fit into the actual ID pages. So they still need to be written down. And then you have, in a way, historical practices of identification, which become, again, important and acceptable for this passport, although basically it's been provided that you can't do that. So while the applicant needed to get a certificate of non-impediment and showcase both who they are, as well as what kind of a person in moral terms, the smartness of the passport is much more one that directs attention toward an electronic register that may be consulted with IT interfaces. While in practice, in the 1990s, many local police officers still complained about lack of resources for actually using these electronic registers, the registers as kinds of infrastructural media provided an impetus for a huge technical shift in passport issuance. So this is an example of a computer vision system that was introduced in the 1980s and used particularly for these kinds of purposes. So it's regularly brought up how 9/11, early 2000, provided an impetus for public discussions on advancing both the scale and scope of electronic registers and automated smart border control. But passport developers tend to suggest that these developments were well underway already in the 1990s, documented also in ICAO reports. So you'll see mentions about advancing, in a way, the kind of smartness of passports already then. The major changes discussed at the time and probed dealt with machine readability, not just of the specific data structures mentioned earlier, but both of facial images as well as fingerprints stored on a microchip inside the passport, as well as the necessity to share information to external stakeholders. And here, a novel importance of a structuration of the face became important because of the necessity to become machine readable. So this is from ISO standard for e-travel documentation. And many of you will know then these very clear arrangements of how the body needs to learn to sit in order to become decipherable. And in many cases, in the beginning, we find, as we find in some of these standards, very clear camera arrangements and arrangements of how to become depicted. But many of us today would not need anymore this kind of a clear technical arrangement in order to be depicted correctly, because we've embodied the sense of how to become machine readable. It's become on the one hand second nature to many of us, and on the other hand, of course, the technologies have also advanced. They're faster, for example. And because the images for machine readability at the time they became implemented needed to be readable both by machines but also by human beings, and facial recognition technologies at the time were not yet as advanced as they today are. Many facial recognition technology algorithms were much better at recognizing faces if they would be similar to those ones on the left-hand side. So you wouldn't have hair or any externalities to the face. And humans are much better at identifying people if we actually have the full face. So they came up, and that links again to the work by Susan Lee Starr of trying to find specific mediations which work for very, very different kinds of purposes, and also at times for people who don't consent with each other. They came with a standard which deals with the cropped form, which you see below, which is a kind of a solution which is not perfect for either humans nor machines. So the idea was to be able to have human examination of facial images with sufficient resolution in order to see moles and scars, for example, and human verification of identity by comparison of persons against facial images, so having images in front of you and then being able to look at the person too. But then computer automated face biometric identification called one-to-one comparison and one-to-many searching. So these were often contrasting needs for those technical images. In Finland, the population information system became very important, a main source for information on passports, and no separate non-impediment certificates were anymore needed. And today, if passports are applied for regularly, no visits to meet local police officers are necessary. So there's a kind of an ideal of a total automation of the identificatory process, which builds on specific kinds of database structures, which are considered to be sufficient for identificatory purposes. And if we think about the passport as a medium of movement, there's the kind of a need for an interoperability among a range of registers and databases, of which some are national and some are international. And that means that in most cases, the file formats used, as in this case, they are not perfect, but they are compromises in regards to the different kinds of stakeholders that need to be able to use them. And here you'll see a specimen from 2006. There would be something to say also about the people who developed them, and especially who are shown, for example, in the specimen passports. Often they are people who work within the field at least. So they face, if you work basically in that kind of field, your face might become a kind of an exemplary model of how someone should be using these documentations. And some of you might remember, for example, Francis Galton's work on the fingerprints, where on the first page or on the cover page, you'll see Galton's own fingerprints, which is a kind of a similar example. And then you'll see these modes of trying to show the security of these devices by revealing some of the security feature, as the Finnish police has done, but most of the security features are never shown. And the representational function of the facial image, which is lost in these very clearly structured faces, which I showed you, become visible then again in the passport pages. So you'll have, like here, very classical, basically national romantic imagery of natures, which one of the developers has taken while hiking in a national park in the northern part of Finland, which then becomes part of the passport design, somehow trying to be ennobling as the facial portrait photos were in the beginning of the history of the passport. So to conclude, what we tried to do with Paula is to identify particular kinds of changes in the history and the material that we collected. And we identified 4 ones, the pre-photographic period, where the function as a letter of reference was much more important. The institutions and persons actually giving out the document were much more important than the persons being identified. The introduction of photographs, bringing these 2 aspects together, so identification starting to become important, some forms of embodiment within the document becoming important, specific kinds of traces, but they had a particular kind of awakeness, which was changed at the end of the 1950s, but especially in the 1960s with the structuring of faces and archives. So structural reforms in the archives changed a lot of it. And then you could argue that with the machine readable passport documentation, especially in regard to the biometric information, these scenarios of zero user interface and full machine readability have become a reality. So that's what currently many of the people in the field are working on. So we'll see that individuation, registration, and digitization all have long histories. And smartness, in a way, has been differently configured in earlier passport regimes. And for today, still probabilistic automation remains a problem for identification, not just technically, but also in terms of responsibility. So some of the people we have talked with say that they still need to have a very clear bureaucratic work process, because it has legal implications if someone does not get a passport, for example, or is not allowed to enter the country, and someone needs to be accountable. And the methods of becoming accountable are again not opened up to the public, so they are kept secret, and it's a kind of a black box, not of the technology, but of human decision making. The human remains thus in the loop, but is much less visible in the actual documentation. Archival changes affect how smartness may be lived out. And these kinds of smart passport scenarios may become much more feasible if data flows and privacy regulations are severely loosened. And if we look historically, very often wars and violent attacks have been significant for the kinds of changes in specific data collection. So these are 2 of the published resources that you'll see, and we are trying to write an additional piece which would be in English, so it would be accessible for other people too. So thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to discuss some of these thoughts with you.
Thank you so much, Asko. It was really a great conference. We will open to questions. I don't know who wants to start. Yo puedo traducir las preguntas para aquel que quiera hacerlas en español.
Sí, se puede preguntarme en español también, y si no entiendo, es muy posible que no entienda. Mercedes a lo mejor va a traducir.
Bueno. Juan.
Muchas gracias por la presentación, el profesor. No sé si la hago en español, ¿la traduces o...? La voy a tratar de hacer muy específica, muy concreta. Teniendo en cuenta que a fines del 19 y hasta 1914 estos pasaportes eran muy simples, después con la aparición de la fotografía, pues se va perfeccionando el documento. No sé si encontró algún tipo de evidencia con falsificaciones para grupos subalternos que no podían acceder a un pasaporte, que trataran sí, de elaborarlo de otra manera y poder acceder a una frontera, a otro país. Si hay algún tipo de evidencia de ese sentido, en ese sentido.
Sí, gracias por la pregunta. Sí, if it's okay, I'll answer in English because it's easier for me. And I'm sorry for the inconvenience. I hope if I have the chance again to speak more Spanish, then it might come to me. But that's a good and important question, because of course some of the changes had to do in passport documentation had exactly to do with the aspect that other people were using the passports, and also that they could be tampered with relatively easily, especially since before World War I, you would basically have the name of the person and maybe an occupation of the person. So anyone could pretend to be the person. And you started to notice that started to happen. So that was one of the main reasons why then during World War I, there was this kind of an idea that let's put a photograph in that will assure that the document is correct. But as you saw with the photographs, and it's not just the case in Finland, but we have the example of the Finnish material, the photographs were often very difficult to use for identification purposes. So still, there was this kind of an idea of tampering. And I personally find it an interesting question if you look at the history of the passport, and you can argue that, well, you find mentions of travel documentation in the Bible, for example. But if you think about the history of the passport, maybe until the 16th century, you have several examples of them. And they've been developed, and there's been put a lot of energy and a lot of money in developing passports. Why is the passport not ready? Why don't we have a documentation which would not allow for that tampering which you asked for? And usually when you talk with people in the field who develop these, there are two aspects. On the one hand, they are afraid that the technologies which they develop, the security technologies, there will be other people who find ways to crack it. And if previously passports, you could get them, for example, for 10 years, or we have a lot of examples where people use the same photos all over and all over again. Today, the idea is that usually you should have a passport only for 5 years, because then already the security technology might not be good enough anymore. And on the other hand, there's always a suspicion, and that's of course the main suspicion, and that's why passports exist, is that people suspect human bodies, that human bodies can change enough, or there are ways to tamper particular aspects with fingerprints, for example, or particular aspects of your face that you cannot be identified anymore. And it's I don't think it will ever be solved in a way. So the question regarding World War I, 1914, and the time before, I think it's still very acute today.
Thank you, Andres.
Sorry. Okay, thank you very much, Asko, for your presentation. It was amazing, and it is a pleasure to have you join to the workshop today. I was reading the paper about the passport regimes, and I follow the presentation. I was thinking about, or maybe the question is, if you found some relations between these Finnish regimes of passports and what happened in other countries, or yes, or I don't know how to. If you can, if you can show, or if you can watch if you can watch international regimes of passports. I don't know if you found some aspects that allow to you talk about international regimes and the connection between these international regimes and the Finnish regimes of passport. Thank you. Sorry for my English.
No, it's mucho mejor que mi español. So thank you again for the kind invitation. And then this question, it's a really good question, and I think one of the aspects why personally I think passports are very interesting is that they need to, and today even more so than earlier, there's this kind of an idea of a mass mediation of the document, and it needs to fit basically every country, every place where people would be traveling to. So it's basically, you can think of a passport like Coca-Cola, or a kind of, you'd say, it's a kind of an imperialist gesture or a colonialist gesture on the one hand, that the same format should fit everywhere. And in order for you to participate in passport regimes, you have to accept being surveyed in particular kinds of ways and giving out your information in specific kinds of ways. And for that to work, you need to have international agreements of how that work is done. And that's what you see already with the First World War. So it was basically many countries said this needs to be done. And then there was a convention some years later in the 1920s formulating basically the standards of today's passports in the 1920s already. So you have international agreements which became binding for many. And I think passports have something, we all know that depending on the kind of a passport which you have, you may travel into different places more freely or not so freely. So some people want to have particular kinds of passports because it allows them to travel. And in order to get those passports, you need to become part, basically, of a kind of a specific group of countries which accept your sovereignty as a specific kind of a trusted partner. And the way of becoming this kind of a so-called trusted partner goes very much via these international standardizations. And of course, there are many pushes, like with the biometric travel documentation, which should be electronically readable. The push came a lot from the US, but also from ICAO, which is one of these aviation organizations, which builds quasi-standards for international travel. So many airline companies were very much involved in that as well. But we have only looked very closely at the Finnish material because it was very difficult to collect because no one collects passports in that sense. But I think it's also important to bear in mind that there might be very important differences in different countries. So it might be that there are important differences in Argentina, for example, or important differences somewhere else. And I would not know, but I would be very interested in looking at them, tracing at them, and having discussions about comparative work.
Thank you. And now is Lila.
Yeah, thanks, Mercedes. And thanks, Asko, for this inspiring presentation. What I was wondering is about the role of state behind each period you present. I mean, it seems to be pretty clear that in the period 3 and 4, the state gets even more involved each time. But I was wondering what happened in the pre-photographic period. Apparently, it's just letters issued by a private person or something similar without the intervention of any, I don't know, public office or something like this. And I don't know if in the introduction of photographs, the states became more involved, or I don't know, because in the photographs you show, it seems to be taken in a particular shop, not by the state itself. So this is what I have in mind. And thanks so much again.
Yeah, thank you for the very good question. So the state is important in all of the passports. So it's always very important, but the way in which the state is represented differs very much. So in the passports, in the pre-photographic era, the state is represented by particular individuals who by their own name are representatives of that entity in itself. And what later on happens is that the individual people representing the state are not anymore named in the documentation itself. So it becomes an abstract entity, and that maybe also gives them the kind of sense that this abstract entity would be more important than in the earlier documentation. But I think the importance of the individual person in the pre-photographic era representing the state is that it specifically showcases the importance of physical contact in order to become part of that interweaving into the accepted group within the state. So everyone else would be basically excluded if you don't have the personal contact to particular people.
Thank you. And now, Christian.
Hello, thank you. Thank you, Asko, for your presentation. I have only one question. Is following your presentation, I noticed that the fingerprints are not used a kind of method of identification. And follow all other studies, I know that, for example, in the identification document, there are not included the fingerprints. There is a kind of resistance. There are in this time of crisis, there are voices in the state or organization who want to include the fingerprints or against the fingerprints in Finland?
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. And you could, in a way, think, if you look at other histories, like the history of the fingerprints shows that India was very important as part of an colonial and imperialist enterprise of England to be a kind of a test bed for fingerprinting, and a lot of the work which had been done for many years became then important for Galton, who in a way systematized that kind of work. And I think it bore, again, from this kind of a perspective of a kind of a social representation and a specific kind of an idea of elitism, that it had a specific stigma for your fingerprints to be used. And it was only something which was considered to be acceptable, not for those who have the social privilege, but for other groups of people. And I think that's the same reason why it took so long for the photographs to become structured so clearly, because in the 19th century, you had these ways of structuring faces already, and you have a lot of anthropological studies of physical characteristics of different kinds of indigenous populations, for example, but that was usually never used towards those within the privilege. So I think the history of the passport now in the example of Finland, but I would be surprised if it would be very different in quite a lot of European countries, for example. It's a kind of a history of privilege as well. And that's why surveillance understood as care or surveillance understood as empowerment is so important, because those aspects which are connected to surveillance as control, like fingerprinting or like the mugshot, did not seem to be okay enough to be implemented into the documentation. And of course, today, the Finnish passport does have fingerprints, and Finland does have a passport register, which many European countries, for example, do not have. So there's a kind of a long history of when it became normalized for specific biometric markers to be collected into databases and for people basically not questioning it anymore.
Thank you.
Thank you. And now is Miguel.
So thank you, Asko, for your presentation. I was thinking about what you showed at the beginning of your presentation about this, I cannot remember the full name, it's red carpet identification system. It was very impressive for me. This is something it's new for me. I mean, so I find this like very impressive, because it's like a new way, it's like a new panoptic view of society. So I was thinking, or what do you think if the implementation of this identification system in the Finnish airlines like has some impact on racial profiling? I mean, if through this identification system, officials can decide who is a good traveler or who is not a good traveler according to some ethnic or racial terms. And also, if this system is like being used by the Finnish state in other areas, maybe for protection against terrorism. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. That's an excellent and important question. And of course, if you ask the people who develop those systems, they will say, no, it doesn't have any it does not do ethnic profiling or racial profiling. But we know from studies on facial recognition algorithms that there's huge bias towards white or light-skinned faces, and they are better detected with them, which raises the likelihood of people with other skin color to be taken out of line and to be questioned then further. And I think there's also the kind of an implicit assumption among many of the developers, and we see it with a lot of camera technology development in other fields as well, mobile camera phones, for example, or other cameras. There's this kind of an implicit thought that the people who would be using these would be white or light-skinned anyway, because they would be the ones with the social privilege. So we don't have to think about those kinds of questions. And that's why they are the kind of a normalization and banalization of these kinds of surveillance technologies through the ideas of care and empowerment as specific modes of surveillance, at the same time heightens then specific, or there's the chance of heightening specific injustices, racial and ethnic injustices very heavily. And then there's the second aspect to it, which I think you can think about the kind of the diagram of the apparatus, how you have to stand in order to be depicted correctly, in order to be machine readable. You can in a way think that for those kinds of zero user interface travel environments, the idea is that the whole environment will be structured in a way that it basically is a laboratory where everyone involved learns to act in particular kinds of way in order to be depicted correctly, and some people just fall because of who they happen to be, how they happen to look like outside of that scope. So there are important asymmetries built into that, and that's an important point of critique.
Thank you. Any other question? Well, so, okay, Marisa.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation. I just have a curiosity because I have always used glasses, and in Brazil, you cannot use glasses for any document. It's as if you have to have your face naked. Nothing. You cannot have anything that distracts your recognition. Just a curiosity, because I saw many glasses in the passports that you showed. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a very, very good point. So glasses have been long okay, and especially with the non-standardization of the facial images, but also when the structuring started, you see that in some of the images, there are aspects which machines could not read, for example, for those images, because some areas of the eyes are blocked, for example. And I think the importance at a particular time to have, in a way, what you call a naked face for these kinds of images is that the facial recognition algorithms are considered not to be, in a way, proficient for differentiating enough one person from the other. But if you, on the one hand, have a kind of a faith in the technology, or you have a pool of population imagery, which you can use for comparisons, then it might be, again, okay to use the glasses. And Finland has a very small population compared to Brazil, for example, or many other places. It's around, I'm actually not sure about the exact amount today, but maybe around 6 million people. And the people we've been interviewing who work on passports, they've been, in a way, talking about the kind of a situation which they have, where they have basically 6 million images of faces, which they can use for training the algorithms which they use, which is a very different kind of a scenario which you have in many other cases and in many other places, because you might not have that kind of a full amount of facial images, because passport registers, for example, do not exist, or then there's huge ethnic diversity, making it very difficult to make these comparisons. In Finland, there's some ethnic diversity, but very little compared to Brazil. So I think that might be also one explanation.
Okay, thank you.
Any other question? So I have a question. If I didn't understood wrongly, you said that in 1969, a national population register was founded. So what well, it seems quite late in the 20th century. And I was wondering about if previous to this date, there were many, institutions that could give passports. I understand that at the beginning, in the pre-photographic period system, it was like that. But I wonder, during the 19th century, if there was some problem with like a state centralization, it was like a slow process, or if there was some other way to centralize the issue of the passports before this date?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And you're correct that for a very long time, there were specific local authorities which provided passports and also had passport registers. And you still needed to get these non-impediment certificates from the church, for example. And then because Finland became independent relatively late compared to many other places, so 1917, getting sovereignty from Russia at the time when the Russian Revolution started. There was a huge civil war in Finland, and there were long, in a way, very difficult relationships between specific families or people living in particular kinds of villages, and in regard to the kinds of deeds which were done to each other. So I think the kinds of idea of having very quickly a very centralized state register was also difficult at the time. But it also had to do with information infrastructures. So just getting information about an applicant, if you would have a national register in the 1930s, for example, it would take a lot of time in order to get that information. So it was basically also easier to be decentralized, but it provided a lot of local idiosyncrasies. So a lot of differences also between how people managed the whole process.
And related to that, I wonder if with this national registry, there was also a national document altogether with a passport, like a national passport, or it just issue passports?
Yeah, so there's a separate document, which is a kind of a personal ID, which has its own history, and the difference is that you don't necessarily need a passport. You only need a passport in order to travel. But the kind of an ID you need anyway. But in Finland, they are currently interchangeable, so you can have one or the other. But it's made difficult for you to use your passport in everyday life because it's so much bigger. So you cannot carry it along with you in the same way in which you would carry the personal ID, which is the size of a credit card. So you can have it where you would have your credit card as well. And the registers for both of these, for the national ID or that card and the passport, they talk somewhat to different kinds of databases and registers again. So for the state, it's actually good. Of course, they want to have more information about each citizen. So for them, it's good for people to have both of them. So they have the same kind of an information for different kinds of users.
Thank you. Any other question? Okay. So, Asko, it was a wonderful conference. I think we learned a lot, and we are willing to continue talking with you. We are doing like periodic meetings during the year. So we hope we will contact you during 2024 to continue these conversations.
Yeah, thank you. I'd be very, as I tried to say in the beginning, I'd be very happy to hear more about all of your work and to learn about what you're doing. I've heard about the work of one of the participants, which is very interesting, but be very happy to hear more about the other ones as well. And I'm very sorry that this is a very tight schedule work-wise. There's so much to do. Everyone wants the world ready now in the next few weeks. But I'd be very happy to participate in an event where I hear your presentations, your work, so I can learn more about what you're doing and continue the conversation. So
Okay.
thank you very much for listening and for the good questions and for the discussion.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, and for the rest, we are going to meet at 4 for the conference of María Gracia Iglesias, who's going to talk, va a hablar sobre el programa nacional sobre el derecho a la identidad biológica.
Mhm.
So we wait for you at 4.
Nos vemos.
Bye.
Bye bye.
Hasta luego, gracias.
Bueno. Bueno, a ver, vamos a cortar la grabación. ¿Dónde está?